welcome to the Indo-Pacific series with My Security Media and the My Security Marketplace. We are covering off on aerospace, defence and security technology market trends, opportunities between India, Australia and ASEAN. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for My Security Media. This particular session, we are covering off on one of our 4 domains. We cover off on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. Last week we covered off on cities and infrastructure for our first episode, and this did follow our India Reach series. We covered off on our India and New South Wales smart cities strategies, and that is now available on My Security TV and our YouTube channel. This particular episode, episode 2, we're looking at national cybersecurity, and in particular, we're going to look at the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy, which was released just earlier this month. And we are joined by our esteemed panel and Mr. Ron Gauci, the CEO for the Australian Information Industry Association, the AIIA. Ron, thanks very much for joining us in Sydney. Mr. Sean Duca, Regional CSO, Chief Security Officer for the Japan and Asia-Pacific region for Palo, Alto Networks. Sean, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
And Mr. Ian Yip, CEO for Avertro, and also in Sydney. Ian, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Good work. Okay, we're underway now. And also joined in Malaysia with Dr. Carrine Teoh, Vice President at NTU Alumni in Malaysia, and this occasion representing the Malaysian Women in Security chapter. Carrine, thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you. And let me just catch up on Vandana. Vandana, can you hear us? I can't see you.
I can, yeah, I'm here.
Okay, wonderful. Vandana Verma, who is in New Delhi, I believe, Global Board of Directors at OWASP and InfoSec Girls.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
And waiting patiently in our partnership with the Aerospace and Defence Consultants Association of India, Mr. Raman Sapuri. Thank you very much for joining us also in Delhi. Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you. And on this particular episode, as we normally do, our next episode, I'm just going to run through some upcoming events, and then we have announcements with our Women in Security programs. Next week, we're going to be covering off on COVID-19 and its challenges. In particular, is India future ready? And we have Dr. Amrita Jash, Research Fellow, Centre for Land Warfare Studies, Clause in New Delhi, who has just released a co-edited book from Clause, and we'll dive into COVID-19 and the impacts on national security and also the geopolitical issues that are arising and how COVID-19 is going to mean this or have impacts on Australia and in India. I have reached out to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute also. Hopefully, one of their members will be able to join us for that particular discussion. Just an update on some trends in the region as well. There's a number of massive naval exercises. One is RIMPAC is still underway just off the coast of Hawaii, and also China has 2 massive naval exercises also in the South China Sea. And it's something we will keep an eye on and just update week to week in terms of the geopolitical movements and also the language. It's interesting to have a look at the Twitter feeds coming out of the US Navy. And Duan Dang, who's a Vietnamese analyst, also monitors the situation, so worth having a look. The news just out of today from the Australian Defence Department, $15 million research and development project has just been announced between Defence, Australia's Trusted Autonomous Systems Defence Cooperative Research Centre and Thales Australia, looking at micro-autonomous underwater vehicle swarms and autonomous surface vessels also. Mainly for mine countermeasure technology, but again, using autonomous swarms and drones, also interesting developments in defence. News again today, First Wave Cloud Technologies just signed a partnership agreement with Tata Teleservices in India. Tata is across 60 cities in India, and so good to see an Australian company signing that partnership. They've got 1,200 channel partners, Tata, so very well known in the region as well. This is an interesting report that came out late last week for the state of Australian tech, and hopefully we'll hear from startups such as Ian and Avertro in relation to this also. But in terms of this particular point here, over half of Australian startups feel ignored by policymakers, and I think it's something that we'll take into consideration when we look at the Australian cybersecurity strategy and some of the feedback that has come out of that also. So before we're making a special announcement, Vandana, we have you. You're next up if you can. If you don't mind, maybe introducing yourself to the audience and also what you have on this week for the top Indian women influencers in security. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I was on mute. So thanks, Chris. Today, I'm going to announce about the cybersecurity women influencers in India. So this is one of its kind which is happening in India, wherein we are trying to bring top 20 women in cybersecurity influencers who are helping the community and who are helping the organizations becoming cyber secure. So that's going to be announced on 27th August. It's going to be a live event wherein all the names will be shared, and following that up with all those women, we will be giving them few sponsorships and other details that will also be announced. But this is happening in India for the first time, so we are really looking forward to it. And there are some eminent personalities who are going to join us. To name a few is Kiran Bedi. She's one person whom I've always looked up to, or she's women role model in India. So, and apart from that, Mrs. Meenakshi Lekhi, member of, then Boni Batlin, she's part of a Canadian cybersecurity team. We have Aman, we have Rajan Luthra. So the whole panel of judges is really amazing. And when I talk about the participants or the nominations that we received humongous nominations, over 250 nominations, wherein we had to, like, taking out top 20 women was really a tough task. But now we have come up with the list, which we will be announcing on 27th.
Wonderful. And the next announcement in relation to that, and this obviously follows on the heels of our top 20 women in Singapore event that we held a fortnight ago, and that has been very warmly received. We are announcing the top women in security in Malaysia, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Carrine Teoh. Carrine?
Okay, hi.
There you are. Thank you.
To represent, I'm here to represent Malaysian women in security. So basically, we are a network of women that is in security domain. Our aim is actually to connect, engage, and also to support women across the security domain in Malaysia. So our aim is actually to inspire and to be inspired. So as I mentioned earlier on, this is actually our first project for Malaysian women in security. So we're gonna announce an award for top women in security in Malaysia. So far, this is going to be organized together with my security media, which is with Chris, right? And also with Sekra. And this is for this event, we also have gotten good support from ISACA Malaysia chapter and also ASIS International Malaysia. So for Malaysia, this award's gonna open, and the nomination gonna be open from 8th of September onwards till middle of November. And from that, we're looking at results to be announced at the end of November. And the actual Top Women in Security in Malaysia Awards Day will be in the first week of December. So we are hoping to get a lot of response and good support from the women's security community in Malaysia.
Wonderful, and we're very pleased to be involved. I think the way that the Singapore event was well received, we're looking forward to this one as well. And as you said, Carrine, there isn't anything like this in Malaysia that you've been aware of previously.
Yeah.
And as an ISACA member and an ASIS member, it's good to see both of those organisations supporting it. I believe ISACA Malaysia may even be a co-organiser at this stage. They're definitely down as a supporter, and I think they're coming on as a co-organiser. So look, 8th of September, so that's end of next week. Nominations will be open. We'll have that on our asiantechsec.com website also, and you'll be able to nominate or self-nominate for those particular awards. So thank you very much, Carrine. Vandana, you're going to potentially jump off in about 20 or so minutes, so we appreciate your time. You're welcome to stay on. And Carrine, given your role, Carrine, I've forwarded you a copy of the cybersecurity strategy, which you've had a look through. So you're very welcome to contribute to the panel session, and I will put you on the spot with a couple of questions as we come through to that.
Yeah.
And also for the audience, the strategy itself, there's three handouts that are available for you. One is the Cybersecurity Strategy IAP report, the industry panel report. One is the top 20 women in cybersecurity in Singapore booklet, so you can have a look at the 20 winners there. And obviously the Cybersecurity Strategy 2020 is available in the handout section on this particular platform. So without further ado, this system is really giving me a hard time today. I'm getting delays and all sorts of things. So thank you to the 5G network. I won't tell you the provider. Coming up next week with Shemaine Tan, this is a great series. I think she's got 4 lined up in this particular series. Let me just check that this is coming up okay. The Blackout series, Leadership in Crisis Times. Platinum sponsor is Recorded Future, with partners Privasec, My Security Marketplace, and the Cybersecurity Magazine. Episode 1 has Mr. King Lee, Chief Information Officer for Toll Group, who, I can't remember the guy's name, it's just left in my mind. They now have a new Chief Information Security Officer. Sean, Ian, can you help me?
It's Baron Lauderback.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Former CISO for Telstra has now gone over to Toll Group, and most of us will be aware of Toll's dealings in cybersecurity. Someone might even be listening from there today, trying to get as much information as they can. So King Lee next on the 2nd, which will be next Wednesday, online as well with cyberriskmeetup.com. And 2 podcasts, one that's just come out. This is a great podcast from our Singapore correspondent, Jane Lowe, and Leslie Shannon, Head of Ecosystem and Trend Scouting, Nokia, based in San Francisco, just looking at virtual reality, 5G and other innovation trends. Leslie has probably the best job of head of Ecosystem and Trend Scouting for Nokia, basically looking at what's coming up for the telecommunications sector. We talked about 5G, and they really dive into the virtual reality, what 5G will bring, and also how I would imagine, getting past the webinar days, we'll be doing virtual reality meetings as well in the very near future. 2022 to 2023, she estimates that will be the reality. And I've just finished an interview with our Fortinet crew for the last episode of our 3-part series with Cornelius Mayer and Glenn Maiden, and we dive into compliance, and I will touch a little bit on compliance in terms of the Australian cybersecurity strategy also, and how it's actually a bit void of the word compliance in particular. We're also working with IBM Security for the ASEAN region and the ASEAN listeners in the audience. IBM Security Virtual Summit ASEAN 2020 is next Thursday also, so you can check that out on the marketplace and register. Just in relation to the summit, there's 2 webinars on the My Security TV channel. One is looking at the cost of a data breach report, and that is particularly looking at the ASEAN insights in terms of cost of data breaches. And I also did a walkthrough of the cyber breach game, IBM Security Terminal. It's probably the best quality game I've seen in terms of gamification of cybersecurity awareness. Timing is everything. It's situated in an international airport. So if you're missing your airport visits, welcome to go and check out IBM Security Terminal. Well worth a look. And Raman, if you don't mind, I won't give myself an award. This is following our India Reach series. Thank you very much on behalf of the Aerospace and Defence Consultants Association of India.
Congratulations, Chris. You deserved it long back.
Thank you very much. That was a flawless 8-part series on the India Reach series. Episode 2 has not gone very well for me so far in terms of the start of our Indo-Pacific series, but thank you very much. It's great, great to be associated with the ADCII. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank goodness we got through the introduction and I can shut up. I'm going to hand over to Ron very shortly. So this particular panel gave insights into the release of the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy on its release a couple of weeks ago. If I can introduce the panel again, we've got Mr. Ron Gauci, the CEO for the Australian Information Industry Association, Sean Duca, the Regional CSO for Japan and Asia Pacific for Palo Alto Networks, and Ian Yip, CEO for Avertro, which is an Australian cybersecurity startup. We have Dr. Carrine Teoh, Vice President at the NTU in Alumni in Malaysia, and Vandana is still with us, Vandana Verma, Global Board of Directors at OWASP and InfoSec Girls. And Vandana just happened to be speaking at an Australian event last week for kids, cyber kids. So Vandana is familiar with the Australian landscape. We are going to dive into the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy. Just prior to the strategy coming out, we did a webinar with the New South Wales Cybersecurity Task Force, and I displayed these 4 documents. One is the AIIA's Building Australia's Digital Future in a Post-COVID World. One is AustCyber's Australia's Digital Trust Report, which looks at the economic impacts should a major cyber incident occur. Then we had the Industry Advisory Panel's report into the cybersecurity strategy, and I think there's some 90 recommendations in that particular report. And we also had the 2020 Defence Strategic Update and Force Posture Review also released. So there's been a number of significant documents that have come out in the lead up to the strategy, and there is almost much contemplation about what the strategy had in it. There's a number of documents that are going to be created as a result of this strategy as well. So the strategy itself we will dive into in this particular session, but straight on the back of that was also this new document, Protecting Critical Infrastructure and Systems of National Significance. We'll touch on the impacts on critical infrastructure in the strategy. The other is the National Identity Security Strategy, dated 2012. That is also to be reviewed as a result of this particular strategy. And the other one is Australia's International Cyber Engagement Strategy, and that's going to be reworded and also being updated to become Australia's International Cyber and Critical Technology Strategy. And we have had Dr. Tobias Beacon on our channels earlier, a couple of months ago actually. His role now is Ambassador for Cyber and Critical Technology. So you can see the language around these particular documents. I'm going to invite the panel now. Ron, if you don't mind, I think, in fact, from the AIIA, it was the first release that came to me in terms of the announcement on the strategy, and the AIIA is obviously a premier sort of industry association in Australia. Maybe your thoughts on the strategy first up, and the AIIA's position currently on strategy.
Yeah, certainly, Chris. Thanks for that. The AIIA did release that white paper, and thank you for putting that up. For those who don't know, we're an industry association. We've been around a very, very long time, 40 years, and we represent many aspects of the industry, horizontally and vertically. So anything from multinationals through to SMEs and startups, and in fact, about 80% of our customer base is made up of startups. and also we're an organisation that represents all parts and all segments of our industry, whether it's security, telecommunications, software development. So simple version is we see the impacts of these sort of policies on our member base, and in fact, given that we know that technology impacts every other industry, whether it be fintech, agri-tech, retail tech, etc. We also understand the impact of these sort of policies on other industries as well. The white paper was on the back of the government's request of us as to what a post-COVID environment should look like and where the focuses should be, and we're delighted by the fact that whether it's the Prime Minister or the Premiers have asked their cabinets to look at that white paper and look at the recommendations and come up with a series of what we call click-ready projects to implement the recommendations. There were 4 parts to the recommendations: building a national digital backbone, building a digital Australia that is secure and resilient, and that's the main topic we'll come to in a moment, building digital skills for the future, and tax incentives and government procurement reform, which is also plays a part. In terms of the COVID situation, what we've found with COVID is that as homes and businesses lend more to becoming digitised and being online, that's also increased quite dramatically the number of cyber threats and the number of cases now being reported, and there's plenty of data on this. I don't need to hit numbers on this, but the many businesses and the many security threats, not only of national significance but also impacting small to medium business, is a significant issue, and clearly we need to build up our ability to be not only in a secure economy but a resilience as well. So the first part there is, how do we make sure that our businesses are secure? The other part inside that, of course, is many small to medium businesses don't have the knowledge, let alone the resources, to secure themselves. So there is an exposure there. If you translate that to the impact of the supply chain process, then, and Toll's a good example of part of a supply chain that's been impacted. It doesn't matter how big or small you are, there is a risk and there is an impact on the economy. So we can talk further about that, Chris, when we come to question time, but there's that part. The infrastructure itself, that we have digitised our homes and we've provided national infrastructure around the country. How do we make sure that that infrastructure provides us with a secure economy, secure environment? And then the other part to all of this is the skills set, and from a skills point of view, we already have a massive shortage of cybersecurity skills in this country, and it's only getting more pronounced. So part of our recommendations is making sure that we're providing a skill base, whether it's upskill, cross-skill, or creating awareness that we think there needs to be a skills agenda, backed by then better incentives to enable investments in building up our cybersecurity resilience. And we know that we are well down the ladder globally in terms of the incentives we have that we provide both as our small to medium and startup environment in terms of their ability to develop secure, globally marketable and contestable product suites. So there's some quick bursts there, Chris. I can keep delving in, but I think that gives you a summary in terms of where the focus has been for the AIIA, and therefore we came out when we saw the government's initiatives. We were very supportive of the steps taken by the government to start to address those issues for us and for the industry and for the general economy.
Yep, thanks, Ron. And I'll put you on notice in terms of a question on, I think I'll come back to you on how much the strategy actually does talk to industry. Some of the comments are it's very sort of government focused again, back onto law enforcement, particularly where the money is, and we will come down to the breakdown of the budget. But there is a national workforce growth program. But the other one is around, particularly around anyone in your membership dealing with critical infrastructure. There's a new regulatory framework coming your way, and I know from the voice of industry has always been, don't regulate us, but I think there's going to be a stick coming eventually. And I think with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Ian. Ian, you've come from a large vendor and now you're a startup. And so there's a whole journey, the whole story there in itself that I'll cover off a podcast with you eventually. But yeah, maybe your perspective because it wasn't gleaming in terms of the startups. Yeah, your perspective on the strategy and some of the background to your comments.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off with positives. So the positive aspect is the strategy did shine a light on critical infrastructure and helping small businesses and the average person be more cyber resilient. So that's great from a marketing front of mind standpoint. But to your point around them using a stick of regulation, I was a little disappointed that the words board and executive appeared in there in the context of what we mean in terms of board accountability exactly once, which says to me they're going to use regulation to tell leadership top down that they need to be cyber resilient rather than talk about culture and top down pressure and really treating cyber as a real business risk, which it really is. So I think that there probably needs to be a bit of work there to correct that a little bit, to be much more about a cultural thing than just regulation. And you talked about budget. I actually spent about 3-4 hours just looking at the budget breakdown, and over 90% of it is going straight to the government. Yeah. And I tried to be a little bit more lenient about it and say, okay, if some of this is indirectly going to come back to industry, how much of it is going to come back to industry? And so about a third is going to possibly flow back to industry to help. And I'm not talking about startup, I'm just talking about outside of the government. So for the most part, it seems, and I may be a little harsh, it's more about shoring up Australia's stance on the world stage of being a cyber player than it is about really collaborating, helping with industry in total. In terms of the outcomes, I think we could have been clearer on it. Some of the measures and KPIs were literally open to interpretation, where there were things like, if you just improved it by a little bit, that was a win. So I think we needed probably more precision to saying we need to improve it by 25% for it to be a win, rather than if we improve by 0.1%, we count it as a win. And then if I bring it back to startups, one of the best things about the last cyber strategy was the formation of AusCyber. And AusCyber continues under the leadership of Michelle Price to do a great job. And we get a lot of value as a startup from that ecosystem and the support AusCyber provides. And I found it lacking in terms of more mention of how AusCyber and the support for the government for things like AusCyber would evolve with the new strategy. Beyond some mentions of research and putting money into research, which may indirectly flow through to innovation, what the strategy really is going to do for the ecosystem. For example, there's never been a better time than now in terms of innovation and cyber innovation in Australian startups. I'm not just talking about ourselves. We're coming out of Cyberise, and there's a lot of companies in the AusCyber ecosystem that are real serious players on the world stage. And I think it would have been good for the strategy to acknowledge that and acknowledge the fact that the startup ecosystem could really help the resilience of Australia as a nation, the business in general, and certainly the government. So some good, some bad, room for improvement, and I hope the government iterates on that, which they have done for the last one, to kind of fill in some of the gaps that the industry kind of found in terms of analysing it.
Yep. I think, did you see anything in here about AusCyber's actual budget? Has there been any, there's nothing clear in here in terms of AusCyber's budget, and I know last time I spoke to Michelle, she was a little bit unknown in terms of what their funding projections are going to be. So that's one note. I think the other thing in terms of the strategy for the startups is, I've got a sense, and this is hopefully a good segue for Sean, and it's part of the reason why we're doing the Indo-Pacific series, and I've put all these other documents here together, because there's defence and critical infrastructure and systems of significance. When we hear what ASD is coming out, you know, we're under a significant nation-state cyber attack. And law enforcement has always been behind the 8 ball in terms of cyber. That's what they've had to focus on, because it is critical and it's timely at the moment. And Sean, yeah, from a large vendor, and when I read through the strategy, the first quote is from Palo Alto Networks in terms of the balloon out. So congratulations for getting that up and running. Yeah, so your perspective and yeah, your reading on the strategy in that context as well, in terms of a regional and the threat landscape aspect.
Yeah, look, I think it's I commend the government in terms of what they've actually done this time around. It's like comparing it to, let's say, the 2016 strategy. So rather than actually having, 33 strategies or 33 initiatives, sorry, in the strategy, this is really sort of to the point that you sort of said, it's focused. And I think that's what we really need right now. If I think about what money is actually being sort of designated to go towards law enforcement, in particular AFP, we know for years they've been under-resourced. They've had very little funding to actually try and deal with cybercrime from a law enforcement standpoint. So I think it's a great thing that they're actually doing that. From a cybercrime standpoint alone, I love the fact that they've actually called it out, because fundamentally it's a massive challenge that we see right now. Not everything is nation state based, so at least we can actually be a little bit more targeted and focused on really just trying to help out your average mums and dads and anyone that's basically here, like all of us really are, consumers and could be a target and a victim. So I think that's another positive aspect. I think the part around sort of the education awareness, we've been talking about this for a long time, and it's not going to be simply a case of, build a click-clack front and back campaign or something like that. It really is going to be a systematic way that we can start to educate, the 90+% of SMEs that probably really can't help themselves, which I think is a big thing. There's a lot of people at the top end of town, large corporates of Australia, that do have decent, significant budgets to focus on dealing with cybersecurity. Smaller players don't. So how do we actually try and focus and solve that challenge? Clean pipes is something that's probably been talked about for 10+ years. It's great to see that that's actually got a mention. Obviously, Telstra's come out with their cleaner pipes initiatives. Great. I think that's not let's call it the gold standard. I think it's great to see that that's a direction that we should all be heading in, but make it consistent. Every ISP, every single telco, every RSP that's sitting on the NBN network, this is a way that we could start to really stem the flow of cybercrime activity going in and potentially leaving the country as well. So for me, they're kind of the big sort of crux, as well as the critical infrastructure side. We know that there is something that's, people are poking and prodding around right now, so we should be shoring up those defenses. You can definitely sort of say there's a couple of like, oh, maybe this, maybe that. For me, I think the big standout for me, which is something that I've always been banging on the drum, is about the public-private partnership. There's no point people walking around the halls of Canberra coming out with a policy, and that's basically it. It's the more that they can actually start to industry and really work out what would be a better way to try and solve this. And I think this goes a long way in actually sort of achieving that, rather than simply saying, we've got these joint cybersecurity centres, great real estate, and no one was really using it, or it was a bit of an exclusive club to get in. I think it's more a case of, let's really solicit feedback. And to the point of how they actually came up with the strategy, I think it's a positive thing. So, 700 different organisations and individuals basically went along to these open forums. A number of people submitted their sort of responses as well. So I see it as a positive. I see it as a great step forward of what we need to do.
Okay, we might come back to there's definitely that type of strategy in this one, in terms of there's good, and then there is some, I think, some gaps, but you've only got a finite resource base and a finite dollar. Carrine, I think of your perspective, reading that in Malaysia and from a regional perspective, and also, I've been watching Malaysia's sort of national cybersecurity posture increase as well, as it should be, but now it's at the national defence level also. How does it read to you? Do you get much out of a document like this? Is there any learnings when you read something like this from a sort of regional perspective?
Actually, I would like to say that I'm always impressed by how fast the Australian government come up with cybersecurity documentation. The last strategy was 2016, and 2020 you are up with another strategy. I would say that is really a big wow. Like for Malaysia, that is something that we are always lacking in terms of documenting what's our strategy and committing exactly. And I would say that for 2020, your Australian cybersecurity strategy, another thing to be shout out is actually that you actually have actual figure in terms of budget to be spent and the actual actions and everything. So the only thing that I would say that it'll be better if you actually have the accountability for each of the action. So I think, but besides, I think it's very good. And Another point that I like about this strategy is that you actually put cyber criminals to account. Actually, like in Malaysia, a lot of our cyber incidences, more than 70% are actually fraud. And we know that in the cyber space, is like a lot of criminals are moving into the cyberspace is because it's always a cat and mouse thing, and it's always playing catch up. And even that, in terms of borders problems and everything, it's not so easy to get whoever that is accountable to be caught. You know, and another good thing is about the strategy is that you actually get all the relevant party to be part of the strategy, be it from the business side, from the community, and also the government. So it actually shows that it's very holistic approach in terms of making the whole strategy to be cyber safe. And in Malaysia, because of the COVID pandemic, we see a lot more businesses moving online. So cybersecurity, and I see that in a lot more countries too. In a lot of countries, more people are working from home. Businesses who are used to be traditional now have to be online to survive. So this is the time where it's more important than ever to be cyber secure. So, and as Sean have mentioned earlier on, yes, the big boys always have the budget for it, but how about the SMEs and everything? So it always seems to be still a cost. So, and I think the strategy have actually made it to be easy to let SME, be big or small, to be part of the cybersecurity landscape. And it's not just how to say cybersecurity is only a big companies could be part of it. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you very much. One area that has come out, I mentioned this other report, protecting critical infrastructure. As a result, I think because cyber touches all aspects of the economy and critical infrastructure, they've actually determined that they've been too narrow on their scope of critical infrastructure protection. They're actually broadening out the definition of what critical infrastructure is, and then they're bringing in a new regulatory framework. They're also allocating $10 million to a national exercise as well. One aspect when we think about small, medium enterprise businesses and startups, and then we look at the industry advisory panel, there was just no representation there at all. You had telcos, defence, and sort of large American companies as well. There was just a lack of representation. Ron, you've got a political panel, a sort of a government panel as part of the AIIA. What would be your perspective on covering off on an industry advisory panel? Do you think that has that influence that very difficult for the federal government to talk to small and medium-sized enterprises? There's just that gap is just so wide. What else could they have done potentially there? Because other than a national workforce growth program and some online training programs that they're going to put out and hopefully get people kind of thinking about it, there's not much else in there. Yeah, there is a gap in that perspective. What are you seeing and hearing from industry at the moment across the SME sector?
Well, there's a couple of aspects to what you just said, Chris, and clearly from what we've heard from Carrine, Ian, and Sean and Rama, we're on the same page here. We had the AIIA had in the past groups called special interest groups to engage with government on these sort of policy, but we've ramped those up and made them actually more, I guess, more equipped to engage in conversation through what we now call policy advisory networks, and we've identified particular areas, and there's no question that we know there's plenty of SMEs in the marketplace, and the feedback we get from politicians and advisors and bureaucrats is there's too many small to medium enterprises to go and talk to, and politically we can't be seen to be aligned to the large, particularly multinationals and the like. So coming to you as an association works really well for us, and I think that's one of the reasons why we are on many of the panels and in the discussions, and that's why we set up the PANs of the policy advisory networks to be quite specific in terms of the advice we provide and be very specialised. That doesn't mean we're always listened to, and that's a part of the issue. But we're at least having conversations in those areas. The cybersecurity one was not one that we were engaged in conversation, and one of the criticisms we did place was we were equipped to be, we were generalist and independent enough to be, and we would suggest that there was an opportunity, given who we represent and the industry segments that we represent, that we should have been at that table. So I think that's really important, that government does actually have the right people at the table, and there's enough really good organisations representing enough industry segments to be at the table and provide reasonable input. And I think a good example of that more recently is the task force that Minister Dominello put together. There's a good example of how to get the right people to the table and representing various segments without any bias in terms of individual brands and the like. So I think that I'm encouraged by the opportunities that are emerging for these discussions.
I might come back to you, Sean, on that one as well. But Ian, that's a good point, and I mentioned the task force as well. So the states, and I talked about the federal government gap to small and medium enterprise. The federal government is a big beast, and it needs to do big things. And is small and medium-sized enterprise and startups are more suited to the state-based strategies and the state-based initiatives that we're going to see, because now the states will come out with their own strategies, and the New South Wales cybersecurity strategy. That's something that you can then tap into better. That's more suited to you.
I think for rightly or wrongly, the states, when it comes to procurement, particularly what Minister Dominello is doing with the task force, tend to be more agile. So I think I can applaud the New South Wales government and how they're putting that forward, how they're putting it together. And I'm actually excited to see that come through. I can't obviously name the departments I've spoken to, but they're actually much more actively looking to work with Australian companies than they ever have before.
Yeah.
And they're trying to reduce the barrier of entry for us to do it. I think the federal government aspirationally would like to do it, but there are other, I guess, factors at play that make it a little bit more difficult for them, particularly around the bureaucracy they're used to having to play with. So yeah, that's a good point you're making.
I think that's even why they have to create AusCyber, because they can't do it in the government's framework. How do we talk to startups? Okay, just have to create a whole new agency, call it AusCyber and call it industry and call it a not-for-profit, and there you go, that's us doing that work. So they don't understand in terms of those startup economy, and it's just such a big beast. And Sean, would you agree with that in terms of the startup community and also the sovereign? Maybe in fact I'll skip over that. If you've got a comment, fine. But I'd also want to touch on the sovereignty aspect of what I'm hearing and what this strategy provides. Maybe bringing it back to the critical infrastructure aspect and supply chains. So yeah, just your general thoughts on those comments.
Look, I'd probably say it's hard to comment on the first part. You know, it's hard for me to sort of comment, you know, what a startup is or sort of isn't getting in terms of sort of their working relationship with the government, because we're not a startup.
Yeah.
But I'd say from a sovereignty standpoint, supply chain, I think there's a lot of individual, let's call it subgroups inside each of those core pillars. And I think with the concern that I probably have when we look at this very big problem, and you just say supply chain on its own, it's a very big problem. When you start to sort of tap into that one, I think what really needs to come out of it is sovereignty. I can understand to some extent why that direction sort of gets driven. I don't think sovereignty is really linked to, or should be really linked to, supply chain. Let's force everything to be sovereign. Thus, we create a supply chain, because I kind of go, they're actually two separate pieces.
Yeah. Because
at the end of the day, things will become cost prohibitive for you if you start to force a particular outcome like that. I think what becomes important at that point is where you start to really look at things like transparency. You know, if I have a look at the areas around sovereignty, you know, some key things that really start to come out is product integrity. You start to have source code conversations really popping up at that point. You know, I would rather have a conversation that someone says, have you shared your source code with any other foreign government around the world? Then you can or can't do business in this particular part of government, or maybe all of government. You know, That's something we should be talking about, because that's a real supply chain issue that's focused on product integrity, as opposed to the data must remain in the confines of this country. You know, my own personal belief, what difference does it make if it's physically in this country or outside of the country? Is it safer? I would probably say no. Why do we start to focus on the controls and the rigor that should actually be put in place around managing the risk of what, let's say, you put into, you know, a cloud service provider as an example?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it in terms of, I feel a little bit uncomfortable when I hear the term sovereignty or sovereign. I get it, and again, it's why we're covering off on a, you know, the whole region has been redefined based on sovereignty, trust, and transparency. Carrine, maybe coming back to you, are you hearing something very similar in Malaysia in terms of rise in sovereignty, trust, and transparency around in the cybersecurity context?
I think in terms of cybersecurity, sovereignty is a word that's been around or have to be around, right? So in Malaysia, actually, our focus in terms of protecting the sovereignty is through our CNII, or our protection of our critical national information infrastructure. So we actually have a close group just to make sure that the CNI are protected, and a whole set of policy just to protect it and everything. And as mentioned, some of the previous panelists have mentioned also, that boils down to transparency, integrity, and all that. And in terms of source code, in Malaysia, I would say that we do not have the technology to be self-reliant in terms of cybersecurity. So, and to get source code, I think it's too good to be true, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so in terms of Malaysia, in terms of sovereignty and everything, we do our process and also our mitigation, and in terms of risk management and all that. So ours is main thing now is we have to protect our 10 sectors of CNII. So that is our core. And of course, we have the mitigation plan and all that in place. So yeah.
Thank you. We've also got a trusted network here in Australia. Raman, any comments there in India? And I suppose when we touch on things like sovereignty, India's, and we're going to touch more on India next week, but definitely going through that supply chain issue with China at the moment and trying to find out where those links are.
I think the sovereignty is a very loosely coupled word. If you see what the cyber terrors can do today, it is going to cross all boundaries. It's not restricted to only one country. There's a need of cooperation of sharing the information. And I personally feel that on the global scale, the United Nations has to play a much bigger role, because cyber terror of today, what we see on a screen, or losing your money, or critical infrastructure, could result in a weapon of mass destruction. So what I propose to the panelists is, we need to have a session. What could be the best training, best practices, and how do we define a cyber criminal? There could be some state actors, there could be some non-state actors into this thing. We have been seeing it also. And it is not restricted to only countries. We need to share information. All democratic nations have to come together and safeguard. And I would just one thought for today, that if I take an insurance policy against a cyber attack in my company, is there anyone in your countries and your knowledge who can provide me insurance for that cyber attack? And how do I get compensated for that? This is the thought I want to leave to the audience.
There's two answers there. Yes, you can get insurance. Whether they'll compensate you is another thing. So that's
at what it costs. It's like a pandemic.
Yeah.
Cyber attack is like a pandemic, like COVID-19. Just to add one sentence to that, I just got a breaking news that India has spent something like $5 billion last year on the IoT induction. And this investment is going to increase to $15 billion by next year. So it's a 3 times growth. So as you get into IoT infrastructure and the industry 4.0, there's going to be more and more of challenge for the cybersecurity advisors and so that is where I leave my thoughts to you. Yeah.
I think we'll actually just finalise on those comments on the region, because that's why we cover off on, we have the Asia-Pacific Security Magazine and our ASEAN channel, the ASEAN region and the Indo-Pacific region. There's so much opportunity there for Australian companies to reach into. And I'd imagine that's going to be our next topic in terms of cyber once the release of Australia's international cyber and critical technology engagement strategy comes out, and hopefully that will come through. And I imagine that's going to be explained. Do you see that too, Sean, in terms of the Australian market? You have a Japan and Asia Pacific role. How do you view the Australian market versus the regional market while we've got you, and how much opportunity is there for Australia, rather than just looking internal, as this strategy potentially does, for the startups like Ian? How much opportunity do you see there for the region?
I think that the region is, extremely buoyant. I think there's, we've got varying degrees of, let's call it maturity, from a cybersecurity standpoint. Let's just call it even from a holistic, national cybersecurity strategy. We've got different countries that are at different levels. But then inside each of those countries, you've also got, varying levels of maturity as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Having worked this region probably just under 20 years now, I don't see that sort of changing anytime soon. We've got, the largest population growth anywhere in the world is actually in our region here. So if you think about the gross domestic product that's actually coming out of just all those different sort of numbers, you'd say there's opportunity there. And there's a lot of people that I think are really thriving. And I think there's a lot more opportunity ahead as well.
Right. Well, look, I do too, particularly from our perspective. It's why we're running our series such as the Women in Security in Malaysia. It's why we've just come off the back of our top 20 women in Singapore as well. This particular strategy, just to wrap up, any final comments from the panel? I think before I wrap it up, the AIIA, Ron, in particular, you're on the task force in New South Wales. You've got new regulation coming into the critical infrastructure aspect of the economy. Do you see your role more important as a result of this strategy in terms of making sure that that regulatory approach is balanced with new powers?
Chris. Yeah, well, we obviously do see our role becoming more important, and not only because of the way we view ourselves, but the way our members have engaged. We've had a dramatic increase in our membership base over the last 12 months, a significant increase, and also the tables we're at for the conversations I said earlier. But if I can pick up some of the other comments to make, because we're very supportive of some of the things that have been said. So the whole sovereignty thing, what bemuses me is that we really haven't clearly defined what that actually means, right? And on top of that, as the others have said, we are part of a global, not just regional, but a global economy. And globalization means not only supply chain to the world, but also security threats from the world, right? So we need to make sure we've built up a resilience that localizes, but also is very much part of the globalization. And from that perspective, there are so many important skills and technologies and in fact platforms that we can learn from and pick up from others. So we shouldn't be trying to be isolated from that perspective. I really do think there's much to learn from there in terms of our own capabilities, to Sean's point before. The reality is some very good startups, Australian startups, have become huge on the global scale. So we've got a lot of talent that we offer the world, and there's a lot that the world offers us. So I think we need to keep that all in perspective when we're making decisions from that perspective. And even in terms of some of the multinationals, the fact of the matter is those multinationals have not only invested in our economies and created opportunities for SMEs, but those multinationals have also provided us with the ability to skill up our own country. In terms of the regulatory environment, a quick comment there. We're not against regulation, but as long as it makes sense, as long as it's detailed, as long as it's executable, and it's practical. And I think we've been short on some detail in some of the regulations that we've seen in the recent past, and we'd be wanting to keep people to account for some of the suggestions being made about where the direction of regulations should head.
Well, I think they're going to balance the two, because a lot of that money, as Ian pointed out, is going to ASD and the AFP to upskill and get more people in. And obviously, they are going to have that regulatory approach, and specifically looking at Recommendation 35, government will develop new powers proportionate to the consequences of a sophisticated and catastrophic cyber attack. And it's something that came out of the industry advisory report, where they wanted, you know, from the industry's perspective, there should be a consequence if you attack Australia on a massive scale. And there has been attacks, and so you can get a sense there.
Yeah, sure.
The government's preparing.
And we're supportive of that, Chris. We are supportive of that. But there was a piece of legislation that got rushed through Parliament towards the end of last year that we all know about that could have been managed differently as well. So
yeah.
I would suggest that that there's some pluses in there, but there's some areas of caution as well.
Okay. I think you're referring to encryption, and maybe, is that the one? Maybe
something along those lines, yes.
But look, we've been going just for an hour. The intention here is always to keep the audience wanting more, and it's also will be right for our YouTube video as well. Apologies to the YouTube audience who just didn't get to see this. Just to close off, there's a couple of key slides coming through. I think this was a comment I was going to make in terms of the actual threat landscape. You can see the Australian government and state and territory governments way out in front. So the government is getting whacked with cyber-related incidents, and then other sectors down here. But most of this is critical infrastructure as well. So I think they are simply responding to an uptake in the threat landscape, and it's definitely something that keeps coming through to me as well in terms of threat intel. Just a quick wrap up. There's only it's a very text-heavy strategy, but it is pretty much stripped into governments, businesses, and the community. You can see here a lot of there for the government, law enforcement in particular, but we can anticipate an online training program for SMEs and families. And I've also mentioned that National Workforce Growth Program. Well, they're going to need that anyway to put in 300 or whatever hundreds of ASD staff as well. So look, on that particular note, I'm going to wrap it up. I've lost you guys again. There you are. We've had final comments. Thank you so much for your time on our panel. Ron Gauci, the CEO for the Australian Information Industry Association. Sean Duca, Regional CSO for Japan and Asia Pacific, Palo Alto Networks. Ian Yip, CEO for Avertro. And we'll have you on again, Ian, in terms of our startup series to explain Avertro. There's 2 R's in Avertro, if anyone is guessing. And Dr. Carrine Teoh, thank you so much for your time. We will be in touch as we kick off with the Women in Security in Malaysia series as well. And Vandana Verma, sorry she couldn't join us and give that perspective. But again, we'll also stay in touch with Vandana in terms of the Indian outcomes from their awards on Thursday. Hopefully we might even try and get her back next Tuesday and have a look at who some of the winners are there, Rahman. And just final, that is it, I'm pretty sure, in terms of this particular episode. So look, thank you so much for your time today. There's been a couple of comments from the audience, but no specific questions. So nothing that I brought up from the audience in particular, particularly around the sovereignty. There was a couple of comments as well. But look, thank you so much for your time. The recording will be available on My Security TV, and we'll share that out on the socials. Thanks very much for joining us.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.